My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Okay. Well, we've been going through 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and Paul's argument against the scoffers. And Paul is saying, if the dead ones are not raised, then Christ is not raised. The desired effect of that argument was, Paul, we don't believe that. We believe in the resurrection of Jesus. And Paul's argument, therefore, would be, if you accept the resurrection of Jesus, then guess what? You must accept and believe in the resurrection of the dead ones. Paul said, if Christ is not risen, then your faith is in vain. You are yet in your sins. The desired effect of the argument would be, Paul, we're not in our sin. Our faith is not vain. We believe in the resurrection of Jesus. We believe in our own resurrection life. Paul, therefore, would say, if you accept our testimony as the apostles, if you believe that you are forgiven, you must accept the resurrection of the dead ones. And on Paul goes. Well, some have suggested, some have even written to me in extremely caustic, extremely ugly, extremely unchristian manner, saying, well, Preston, you're just ignorant. You just don't get it. You are actually proving that Paul is discussing physical death. Because after all, Jesus died physically. And Paul says Jesus became the first fruit of those who died before him. And he very clearly has physical death in focus. Well, this argument, it seems to me, completely and utterly fails to consider the entire, quote, rest of the story. As definitive proof that Paul is not focused on physical death or physical life. Now, let me make sure you understand. I am not by any stretch of the imagination denying the physical death of Jesus. I am not even hinting or suggesting that Jesus was not physically raised from the dead. What I am suggesting is precisely what Jesus himself said, what John said, and that is that Jesus' physical death and Jesus' physical resurrection was a sign of the greater spiritual reality. The physical was not the final. Okay? That's what I am arguing. And here is definitive proof of that. Point number one, Christ was the first fruit of those who had fallen asleep, i.e. died, before him. We have already discussed this a little bit. We're going to be discussing it a lot more as we proceed. But ask yourself the question, was Jesus the first to be raised from physical death? Well, clearly not. He raised Lazarus from the dead. He raised Jairus' daughter from the dead. He raised others from physical death. Jesus was not the first person to be raised from physical death. I mean, after all, we even go to the Old Testament and find examples of that, right? So the fact that Paul says Christ was the first to be raised from death, and the indisputable fact that Jesus was not the first to be raised out of physical death, proves that Paul's focus in discussing, i.e. the dead ones, cannot be physical death. But watch this. 10 times in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul speaks of the resurrection of the dead ones, and he uses the present active indicative of the Greek. Now, do you catch the power of that? He does not use the future tense. Certainly not exclusively. Paul uses the present. You know what present tense means, don't you? Passive. You know what passive means? Those of whom Paul is discussing were being acted upon presently when Paul wrote. Now, scholars have struggled with this. This has been noticed by major scholar after major scholar after major scholar. By the way, Sam Frost, in his book, takes note of just a few of the major scholars, world-class scholars, that have gone to 1 Corinthians 15. Take a note of the present passive indicatives that Paul uses to speak of the dead being raised when he wrote, and they've struggled with this. And because of their futurist eschatology, they haven't known, and they still don't know, how to deal with Paul's use and Paul's saying, one will say, with what body are the dead being raised? Being raised? Yes, being raised. But some scholars just basically shrug. Some commentators just say, well, this might be a prophetic present. After all, in Isaiah 53, in predicting the coming of Messiah, in predicting the future suffering of Messiah, the Septuagint of the text uses the present active indicative. And it was 600 years plus from Isaiah until Jesus. So, is the prophetic present tense a valid possibility? Well, we can consider that. However, on the flip side, I'm going to share with you the utter inconsistencies of those who argue, well, when Paul used the present passive indicative in 1 Corinthians 15, he was using that in a predictive, i.e. a future sense, even though he uses the present passive tense. Now keep in mind, theoretically that's possible. Contextually, however, I'm going to show you that is not possible. So we'll see you on the flip side.